The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Is America facing an unprecedented crisis at the hands of radicals? It seems that the days of being able to chase the American dream are slipping away in favor of a collectivist nightmare that holds conformity and compliance in its guiding light. But what are the off-ramps? And are we on the verge of discovering just how to turn this national vehicle around? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we're talking about the roadmap for America, Elon Musk's Twitter buy-in, and is it a win for free speech or not? Why Joe Biden keeps getting it wrong on just about every foreign policy issue available, and what to expect from the Second Amendment and abortion cases before the Supreme Court. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Hastings, Michigan on WBCH 1220 AM and 93.1 FM. Thank you for being here. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows that will whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Let's dive right in. Has America taken an abundance of wrong turns? And is she hurtling towards an ideological cliff edge? Well, to discuss these topics and more, we're fortunate enough to be joined by former U.S. Consul, international business consultant, and author, Mr. Stefan Helgason, who has just released his latest book, American Detour, Finding and Fighting Our Way Back Home. Thanks for being here, Stefan.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be here, Mark.
Great. So, Stefan, briefly, I want to just talk about the sort of a larger scale thing. Now, latest polling puts almost 70% of Americans who say that the U.S. is on the wrong track. Is this the kind of societal malaise that prompted you to write your latest book, American Detour? Or do you see it as something more far-reaching?
Well, Mark, since moving back to the United States after spending 25 years overseas, I've noticed a sea change in my own country that I quite honestly didn't recognize before. And with the election of Barack Obama came a lot of hope and a lot of change. And it wasn't always the change that half of the country wanted. But we muddled through. Some would say got through brilliantly. I would say muddled through. But the current, as you put it, malaise in the United States has been building for some time. My thesis is that it started way back in the 60s with the assassinations of Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy. And that started the cultural ball rolling, and perhaps in the wrong direction. But to fast forward, Mark, I think that the election of 2000, when Al Gore lost to George Bush, was really a watershed moment that started separating the United States into two hemispheres of political thought. So the 4 years, and again, fast forwarding to the Trump years, the 4 years of Donald Trump exacerbated that split and chasm, and now it created a presidency that probably most people don't like. But this,
I noticed the hesitation on the word presidency there.
Well, Mark, it is a presidency, and Joe Biden is our president, and he's my president. And no one wants a president not to succeed, because the success of the United States is also something the rest of the world needs. But unfortunately, we've reached an impasse, a point of no return. And in my book, The American Detour, I use the American journey as a metaphor for following and tracking what's happened in our country over the past 60, 70 years, but more importantly, what's happened just in the last 5.5 years.
Well, let's get into that metaphor a little, please, Stefan. You use this idea of a road to describe how America has left her traditional pathways towards success. I think I have that right.
Yes, sir.
So that's the journey. What's the end as you see it?
There is no end.
Right.
And that's the surprising thing that most people don't want to acknowledge, or if they do, they don't acknowledge it publicly, because the journey continues on for America, just as it does for every other nation on the planet. Our society as such and our culture is constantly being influenced and changed over time by the winds of progress, you might call it, or by economic disparity or success, cultural change, etc. So the journey never ends, but we do have off-ramps from this superhighway of ideology, and we ought to take them sometimes to a rest stop where we can think about who we are as a country and what we want to be when we grow up.
Now, some of the themes that you explore in your book, American Detour, they relate to almost the culture war and the corrupt media. Now, are these symptoms of a problem, or are they the end result of a problem?
I think, Mark, they are a little bit of both, but they are the unfortunate outcome of a free society. A free society that allows for free speech and free expression and exchange of ideas is always going to be a bit tumultuous and will lead to divisions and opposition and conflict. So if you accept the premise that conflict in life is necessary for change and for improvement, then you can live with conflict, but you have to learn how to deal with it.
Absolutely. Although I think it's one of an oft forgotten truism that taking on a burden is the way that we do improve ourselves. Willingly taking on a burden and learning to carry that burden. It's something that not only gives us the skills, it gives us hope for the future because we understand ourselves better. Now, Stefan, one question I always like to ask authors who are kind enough to join us on Liberty Nation Radio: is your book a message of hope, a warning, or a mix of both?
Well, I would
or something else entirely.
Well, it is a look backwards in our rearview mirror of political history to find where the source of our problems lie or lay. It is a critique of modern times based on that historical perspective, and it is a look forward to the possibilities that we can grab, if you will, to change our outcomes for the future. So I'm like every other human being. I'm optimistic at times, I'm pessimistic at times, but basically I'm curious. And I think that curiosity about possibilities is the fuel that fires the engines that drive a society. A society that is no longer curious about itself or about its options or future is a society that is in decline. And I believe that our society is not in perpetual or permanent decline, but that we do need to mobilize a lot of strength, forces, power, wisdom in order to move it back onto the right path again, away from this dangerous detour.
Stefan, where can folks follow your work?
Well, I have a morning email that's sent out from my website, which is called projectpushback.com. They can contact me through projectpushback.com, and my books are all available, all 12 of them, on Amazon.com. You can just search my last name. You'll probably find my cousin's books on there, and as well as my own, but Stefan Helgeson on Amazon.com.
Stefan Helgeson, thank you ever so much for joining us.
And thank you, Mark, and bless you in the work you do for Liberty Nation.
Coming up later in the show, we're talking liberty to find out just how significant the Second Amendment case and abortion case before the Supreme Court are likely to be. But up next, what does Elon Musk's Twitter purchase mean for American freedom of speech?
for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Elon Musk buys up 9.2% of Twitter and gets himself a place on the board. Is this a win for free speech? And what does 9.2% really mean in the world of business? Well, we're fortunate to be joined by economics author and host of the Swamponomics Show, Andrew Moran, to shed some light on the biggest topic of the week. Welcome back to the show, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So tell me, Andrew, 9.2% and a seat on the board. How does this percentage match up to other shareholders? And what kind of sway does this give Musk?
Well, the next three largest shareholders are about 8%, 7%, and 5%. They include likes of Vanguard and BlackRock. So this is not a small amount whatsoever. And what's funny too is that Twitter, the reason why they added him to the board of directors was because they were afraid that he was going to buy even more shares and get a greater stake in the company. So that's why if you look at that filing of the
SEC filing limits him to just under 15%, right?
Yeah. They said, you can't own more than 14.9% of the company if you want to have a seat on the board of directors. So I found that, how scared they were of him trying to take over the company.
So that's what Twitter's worried about, really. They're worried about what I guess we'd term a hostile takeover.
Yeah, they have been. I mean, they're regularly concerned about that. If you look a couple of years ago, there was this activist investor called Elliott Fund Management, and they wanted to oust Jack Dorsey as CEO because they were concerned that he wasn't focusing on the company. He was too focused on Square. So out of concern that they would acquire even more shares in the company, they acquiesced to the demands and said, okay, fine, we're going to get rid of Dorsey, but please don't buy more shares of Twitter. So yeah, I mean, but considering how rogue Elon Musk can be and how unpredictable he can be, I guess it is understandable of why a censorship body like Twitter we're trying to prevent Elon Musk from acquiring even more shares.
Well, let's talk about his rogue attitude here. Now, Musk, he describes himself as a free speech absolutist, but he's also a canny businessman, now rated, I believe, the richest person in the world. Now, are there any indicators to suggest that his choice to purchase the shares is ideological, or is it profit motivated, or could it be a mix of both on that?
Well, he definitely made a huge profit when it was announced because he bought shares on the Friday before the 13G announcement was made. And then that stock went about 33% over 2 days. So he made a killing on that deal. But when it comes to free speech, it's hard to determine if he's going to have much of a say because Twitter already released a statement saying, we're going to focus on what the managers and developers say, not so much on what Elon Musk says. At the same time, I mean, Elon Musk, he's a very public figure. I mean, he'll go on Twitter like Donald Trump and provide all these prescriptions of how he wants to change Twitter, or perhaps he would even say what's going on in the inner workings of Twitter. Before the last month in March, he had a poll saying, is Twitter this beacon of free speech, or is it mostly a lot of censored content? And most of the polls said, it's not a beacon of free speech at all. So and what's funny too, in that poll, he had a follow-up tweet that said this poll is consequential. So you have to be concerned now moving forward that everything Musk does is for a reason. That's why it's funny. There was a market analyst a couple weeks ago, and Elon Musk, he was in Berlin and he was unveiling new Gigafactory, and he was dancing in front of the Gigafactory, and this market analyst said, does this dance mean that some specific stock is going to go up or this crypto is going to rally? So everything he does, people are just homing in with a fine-tooth comb or a magnifying glass to see if there's a message in anything he does.
It should be telling then, really, that with news of Elon Musk taking over and his known position on free speech, that the stock price soared. I mean, that was one of its biggest ever growths, I believe. Yeah. So shouldn't that tell the other people at Twitter, the controlling board, the managers and the developers, that free speech is the way to go forward? And if they focus more on the ideology of censorship, aren't they doing their other shareholders a disservice?
Yeah, see, that's the challenge you have. I mean, I've combed through a lot of analysis that market analysts have provided, and it seems not everyone is certain on why the stock rallied and if it can sustain that momentum, or if it's just people are going to take the profits and run. Because yes, Elon Musk he claims to be a free speech absolutist, and you want to be optimistic by saying, okay, investors bought shares in Twitter because they believe he really believes in free speech, and therefore Twitter is going to stop a lot lot of his restrictive measures that's employed over the years. At the same time, you think, okay, well, Elon Musk, every time he makes an announcement of whether it's, adding Bitcoin to Tesla Motors or saying he's going to buy more Dogecoin, these things go up. So you just wonder if it's more of a pump and dump scheme. Although I will give Elon Musk credit, he always says that he always pumps up stock, but he never dumps it. So you have to give him credit on that part.
I think one of the most notable aspects of this 9.2% buy-in is that for several years, you've had people on the political left saying that if you want a free speech platform, you should build your own. Well, it seems to me that Elon Musk buying into it and taking the most significant percentage that any other shareholder has, that's really the free market approach, though, isn't it? Instead of building your own, you buy somebody else's. Yeah,
exactly. I made this point in my article on libertynation.com as well, that he avoided the headache and the cost and the manpower and the resources of building his own platform without the guarantee to even work. I made this point. There's a baseball movie, Field of Dreams, that if you build it, they will come. But it's already been built. You change it, so they're already there. Why mess around with it? It just needs a little polish. But you've seen a lot of these other alternative platforms that haven't done anything at all. I mean, there's so much buzz about them at first, and then as time goes by, this momentum wanes. You saw that with Truth Social. The two executives, they resigned. Getter has internal issues and had problems with his platform. Parler had all this buzz and momentum in early 2021, but then that faded. And that platform, the interface isn't the greatest at all. So all these alternatives, the intentions are great, but it's never going to match something like Twitter or Facebook at all.
Well, a couple of points on that. I think part of that drop-off in user base is because of Twitter's actions. So what happens is 10 new companies pop up because they're trying to adhere to a free speech principle that Twitter historically really hasn't. And so what happens is a small amount of users go to each one, and perhaps there's some cross-pollination there as well. But there's no excitement about signing up specifically for Twitter anymore. I think that's one aspect of it. But another one is, and I found this very interesting, is that CNN ran a story on Wednesday, I believe it was, where they were talking about Donald Trump's wealth has started moving back up very quickly. And part of that is because of Truth Social. So it brings us back to the ideology over profits question. Donald Trump appears to have made somewhere in the region of $400 million out of Truth Social, even though it's still, as you point out, it's still not particularly user-friendly ready yet. And it's certainly not ready to tackle any other of the big brands on the market. So I'm wondering if a lot of this isn't about rekindling the profit growth and the user growth at the same time with Twitter.
There was a report, I think it was from eMarketer, and it forecasts that Twitter would enjoy about 8.6% growth over the next 2 years. So there would be some return of users even before the Elon Musk announcement. But who knows? Perhaps a lot of conservatives or libertarians who were disenfranchised with Twitter, perhaps they see this move by Elon Musk, and they'll give Twitter a shot again. But there's one thing that Elon Musk should not do, is that he should not add that edit button.
Well, Andrew, as I'm sure you know, good content comes from good editing. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation from 2 to 3 p.m. Sunday on KBKW 103.5 FM, 1450 AM, the talk of Grays Harbor. Later on, we're talking abortion and gun rights at SCOTUS. But after this short break, we ask why President Biden is getting it wrong on every foreign policy decision.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of libertynation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
From the Afghanistan withdrawal to Hunter Biden's laptop, and with a brief jaunt to Ukraine on the way, it seems that President Biden and his administration just can't do right for doing wrong. Now, is it because we mere mortals lack the insight and in-depth analysis of those at the top of the food chain? Or could the issue be something far, far simpler? Well, we're joined by former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller, Dave Patterson, to get to the bottom of why Joe Biden keeps getting it wrong. Welcome back, Dave.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
Grand. So it seems to me, Dave, that a blindfolded chimpanzee with a dart could deliver a more consistent performance on foreign policy decisions. But that's just my opinion. Now, do I have it wrong? And despite what my senses tell me, is Biden doing a great job?
Come on now, let's not discount the capabilities of chimpanzees.
They get it right 50% of the time, apparently.
They do. I think it's basically a fundamental flaw in the way liberals look at the world that gets them into trouble always. They never see the world the way it really is. They see the world the way they wished it were, and that just simply never, ever works.
Yeah, it seems there's a lot of wishful thinking in these approaches, especially with things like building back better, which pretty much every liberalized government across the world adopted at the same time, but is now sold as Joe Biden's centerpiece campaign. But let's talk about Ukraine for a moment. Let's drag that into the mud. From the beginning, it seems the administration it was pretty much on the back foot, wasn't it? Despite even giving warnings that war was on its way, they seemed surprised when it actually did. And they reacted surprised, which is more important, I think. And then of course, we've had the flip-flops on the MiG-29s and a wealth of other missteps and miscommunications. So what's going on with that?
Well, I think it goes back a year. They've had a year to understand that when Putin put his troops, 70,000 to begin with, on the border of Ukraine, that was just a prelude, an overture to what he had in mind. The people who knew what was going on, of course, were the Ukrainians. And President Zelensky said in April of 2021, please help us. This is what's happening to us. And it didn't fit the narrative, because the narrative says, well, we can always sit down with the Russians. They'll see reason. And what possible good would it do for Russia to invade Ukraine? And then again, when Putin came out with his 5,000-word explanation of why he was going to invade Ukraine, nobody paid any attention to it. Not one serious media outlet gave it 2 minutes of airtime. That's why we're where we are.
Yeah, that really does seem a case of the administration was more than happy to bury its head in the sand. And it reminds me, I think it's Dr. Jordan Peterson, that talks about how a problem ignored eventually mounts up. Like, for example, if you ignore a bill, well, you're just not paying a $30 bill. But then, of course, that turns into demand, that turns into a legal action, that ruins your credit rating. And before you know it, the whole world's out of control. And it's because you ignored things when you had a chance to address them in an easy format. Now, I think a lot of people are beginning to feel that the intelligence community is perhaps more devoted to defending the status quo and the reputation of those in the White House rather than solely focusing on American interests. And one thing that springs to mind was the 50-plus former intelligence officials who came out saying that Hunter Biden's laptop was clearly Russian disinformation. Now, that analysis, the air quotes there, set in motion the burying of that whole story, didn't it? And that was right before the 2020 election. But now it turns out, of course, that everybody's admitting that it was completely true about Hunter Biden's laptop, and hearing rumors that a third laptop, but that might or might not be in the hands of the Russian mafia, from what I'm hearing. So are there no consequences for the people who get these things wrong? So, for example, no consequences for the 50 former intelligence officials who branded it Russian disinformation, and no consequences for those that oversaw the desperate withdrawal from Afghanistan, and no consequences for those who ignored all of the warning signs, and not just warning signs, the very pleas from the Ukrainian president for more than a year. Why no consequences, Dave?
Well, there aren't any consequences because they put things in their letter like, we want to emphasize that we do not know if the emails provided are true. If we are right, And so they qualified their letter in practically every possible way and ended with, "We do not know whether these press reports are accurate." Well, if you don't know whether the press reports are accurate, then why did you write the letter? This is the kind of thing that is extremely hurtful to the intelligence community. And I want to be very upfront. I have the greatest respect for the people in the field who have to do the intelligence community work day in and day out.
Absolutely, yeah.
But somehow, when what they perceive as true gets to Washington and Langley, their views of the world tend to get changed through a political lens that's simply not helpful. And consequently, people have less and less revere the intelligence community. And oh, by the way, this letter probably did more, if the Russians were behind it, to ensure that what the Russians wanted to have happen did happen.
Yeah, the self-fulfilling prophecies, isn't it? Now, you know, what you just said there, Dave, it reminds me of the Bay of Pigs invasion fiasco. So you had under Kennedy, you had this whole team of experts who came up with this plan. And the escape plan was, I believe it was some mountains like 80 miles away from the beach where they were supposed to be landing, that they were supposed to just retreat to if it all went wrong. It was so poorly thought out and executed. But then that same team, a few years later, had to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And for all intents and purposes, they got that spot on. Now, I was reading in a book about super forecasters, political forecasters, and the author argues that the reason that the team got it so wrong at one point and so right on the other was that they'd learned to correct each other. They'd learned to be willing to contradict each other and to create arguments and tension and pushback. Now, is that something that the current administration seems not to be able to do?
Now let me reel you back a little bit on they got it right in the Cuban Missile Crisis. They got it totally wrong. The community, the CIA, the executives clearly said there won't be any nuclear missiles in Cuba because it doesn't fit the way the Russians do their business. And in fact, once the flyovers indicated and that there definitely were missiles, the senior executives still said, yes, but we were right because that's not what Russia would have done. So it goes back to the people who have to do the work, the people who look at overhead photographs. They're the ones who got it right. The executives got it wrong. And that's why they had 13 days to react. And at the time, 13 days was a very short period of time. Today, we have 16 hours effectively to react to things. So we got to get it right.
Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be with you.
If you, like many Americans, are waiting with bated breath to see how the Supreme Court will rule in the possible landmark Second Amendment and abortion cases, then don't go anywhere. We're back talking liberty on this exact issue.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
This year may be the most consequential in recent history for the United States Supreme Court. With both abortion and gun rights on the docket and a 6-3 conservative split on the bench, the laws of the land may be in for a long overdue facelift. But to help us pass the good from the bad, we're joined once again by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott DeCosenza. Welcome back, Scott.
You know, Mark, thank you so much for the welcome back. I was caught when you said the 6-3 split on the bench because as we move along, it seems more like it's 5, 1, and 3, and the one being the Chief Justice of the United States. Exactly right, Justice John Roberts, and where he comes down on things is yet to be firmly cemented.
All right. So, Scott, let's dive right into this. There's two big cases coming up. There's one on abortion and there's one on gun rights. Let's start with the gun rights. Now, this is New York Rifle and Pistol Association. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the name of the group sponsoring the the suit, basically.
Okay, and what does the suit involve here?
Mark, the case is basically will decide whether or not, hopefully, I'll say this, by the way, because sometimes the Supreme Court justices like to dispense with a case without addressing the fundamental constitutional issue that the parties who bring the case hope they will address. So there's that. We may not get the decision that we want, meaning a resolution on this issue. But the idea is, can a state deny somebody's application to carry a firearm for any reason at all? So is it a right to keep and bear arms outside the home? That's one way to kind of encapsulate whether and what the case is about. The way the law reads now is states are permitted by current case law to basically deny people's attempts to get a license to carry for any reason or no reason at all. And the proponents of the lawsuit basically want to establish that states, in order for them to deny permission to carry, must have a good reason to deny it, like somebody's a felon or some other nefarious, incident in their past, which would lead them to be unfit, rather than just the state doesn't like when people carry guns outside the home.
So let's get a little bit speculative, and I know you hate this, but realistically, this is the first big gun case since Heller, which was quite some time ago, right?
It promises to be the first big gun case in Heller, and that's the part about the speculation, because they could avoid the big decision through some resolution about a procedural matter or some standing issue. I don't think that that's going to happen, by the way, but I always like to talk about it because, as I say, I think very often, if you expect to be disappointed, that's the most likely thing that, your expectations are most likely to be met with the United States Supreme Court, no matter what your political inclinations or legal inclinations are.
Yeah, we have noticed over the last few years, I guess, that often when you're expecting some kind of bright line ruling, what you get is, well, it's now a moot point, so let's just dismiss the case out of hand.
Or you get a non-bright line ruling, which doesn't allow for real clarity going forward. So I would say the Heller case and the McDonald cases are both on point there. What do they then mean, right? When Heller came out, I was discussing it with people and thought this is like a lawyer's full employment act, because for the next generation, we're going to be seeing cases come up because they didn't issue a bright line rule about what the court actually means when they say it's a fundamental right. What standard of review, for instance, gun cases need to meet. That would be, just for people who are wondering, what would the bright line rule be? It might be in order to implement a gun regulation, governments have to pass a hurdle here and a hurdle there, for instance. But they didn't offer that guidance. And so that's why we're still struggling now in 2022 with understanding what that fundamental right means.
So here's where my speculation just becomes rampant, Scott. Should the Supreme Court rule in favor of New York Rifle and Pistol, what does this mean for gun rights across America if they offer a bright line ruling?
Depending upon what that ruling is, if it's as broad and sweeping as the litigants, the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association want, and what people like me who are gun rights advocates want, Mark, is it would basically shut down and decimate all gun licensing schemes that don't involve a concrete understanding that you have to have forfeited your right to carry a gun through some action, rather than the current status, which is you kind of have to prove that you're okay to carry a firearm. You think about it like a burden shifting, sort of like how driver's licenses are issued in the United States of America, which is anybody who can pass the test gets the license, right? With some exceptions for people who have, like, if you got like some medical diagnosis, you have a seizure disorder, perhaps they can, say you can't have a license because we don't know if you're going to be a safety hazard on the road. And the same thing would be true basically for gun licenses. So if you haven't been convicted of a crime of violence or otherwise indicated in a provable way that you're going to be a danger to yourself and others, you are entitled by right then to carry a firearm. And so what that would mean is the entirety of New York, especially New York City, which is hostile to gun rights, New Jersey, and California, those are the most populous places where we're going to see all those people now have access to carrying a firearm outside the home. And previously it currently, as we record today, Mark, is if you're well connected, you get this right. So if your brother-in-law is the mayor, or you're a celebrity or something like that in these places, you can usually get a hookup. But if you're just John Q. Public and you're running a corner store bodega in New York or a Quickie Mart in LA, you're out of luck, or just somebody who wants to be able to protect themselves in the light of, you see these scenes in Los Angeles, Mark, with these homeless drug addicts that are often antisocial in terms of their personality and, have a propensity towards violence, one much greater than the population at large. And the response times for the police are, of course, laughably long, right, if they ever come at all. So just the kind of everyday personal defense choices that people get to make in many places in the United States, they will now be provided to all these Californians, New Yorkers, and others who have been forbidden to access them.
I think it's pretty interesting because the trend across the nation is towards constitutional carry. I think the U.S. is now at 23 or 24 states that have some form of constitutional carry in place.
Well, I know that that is true. And, of course, Jim Fight, who writes for LibertyNation.com and is the gun law area is one of his focuses. I read that piece. And, the thing that people have to understand is the constitutional carry thing is sort of like the how a sheriff gets elected. They don't have to take a class on having a gun. They just get to, they get elected, they swear, and they put on the gun belt. And, why wouldn't that be good for an ordinary citizen? So there's no requirement that there's some character and fitness proof. It's just like the opposite. The burden is on the state to prove that the person shouldn't be allowed to carry, basically.
Well, it is the state that makes the laws.
Yeah.
Okay, Scott. And the other case that we want to talk about is the abortion case coming up. Now, this, again, there's been, I guess, 2 significant abortion cases before the Supreme Court in the last 50 plus years. Obviously.
Well, there's more than 2, but those are the landmarks, right? We've got Roe and we've got Casey.
So what does this latest case that's coming up before the Supreme Court that they're due to put a decision out on, how does this compare in scope to Casey and Roe v. Wade?
It has the potential to equal or eclipse them in scope, and that is why there's been so much attention paid to them. In any case, the Supreme Court can up and decide, some change in the law if enough justices agree, but seldom do they. Not only seldom do they agree, but seldom do they address an issue that's off the kind of direct path of the appellate issue challenged. And what we have it's Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health is the name of the abortion case. What we have in Dobbs is the Supreme Court has directly chosen to address whether or not these pre-viability abortion restrictions, we'll call them, are legal. Is it legal for a state to basically, restrict abortions prior to a certain number of weeks? So because of the broadness with which they've asked the question presented, anything could happen. We could get a full reversal of Roe. We could get nothing at all. We could, the court, it's one of these mysteries, right? What are they going to do? We'll see.
Scott DeCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
That's almost it for this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I want to take a moment to thank our guests, Stefan Hegelson, Andrew Moran, Dave Patterson, and Scott Cosenza. I'd also like to thank you, the listeners, for taking the time to join us. Now, my final thought for this week. Jack Kerouac wrote in On the Road, "This is the story of America. Everybody's doing what they think they're supposed to do." And in that sentence is the greatest hope and the most potential for danger. In a nation that seems so divided and polarized that more than at any point in recent history, we have different sects, those who seek to live independently, to be their own people, and those that insist on collectivism, that you follow the ever-changing set of rules that no one has ever agreed upon. The individualists want no part of it. They seek to build a life of family, friends, and community, intent on thinking their own thoughts. But a radical element in society sees that as a danger, and herein lies the problem. These collectivists think they're doing the right thing. They think that bullying and coercing their fellow man to a collectivist will is moral. It's not enough for them to follow their own creed. They insist that all others toe the line too. This is not, and never was, the real American dream. But it may be the greatest danger facing it as we move forward into an unknown future. Thank you all for being here.